came much later in 1970, it was, I think, when I read an article in a magazine called, or a journal, I guess, called New Left Review, which was a British magazine, British journal, by a woman called Juliet Mitchell. And it was called Women, the Longest Revolution. And that article just totally opened my eyes to the fact that, I mean, I was a Marxist back then. I was a young lefty. I was, as far as I was concerned, there was nothing I couldn't do with my life. And then I read this article, and she kind of laid out in extraordinary detail in this article, which later was published as a book and it became a very influential book in the early 70s. She just laid out the 4 areas in which women were not treated equally. And she looked at education, she looked at employment, she looked at the family, and I think she also looked at reproduction. And she just spelled out for us in ways that were completely unassailable and and resonated with me that, oh, hey, I hadn't thought of that. No, I didn't realise that. And there were things that were reinforced for me very quickly. For example, I remember when I was still at Adelaide Uni, I applied for a job at the ABC, and it was a job as a specialist trainee, which is an entry-level job. And they published the list of salary or wages or whatever they were called back then, and they were different for women and men back then, girls and boys. But what was so shocking to me was that a boy who had only been in high school got paid more than a girl who was a graduate from university. And that was there. It was in black and white in the advertisement that women were just not regarded as not equal, but inferior to somebody who had less education. And so once I'd had my eyes opened like that by Juliet Mitchell, every time the world kept reinforcing these views because they were accurate, they were right, and we just hadn't realised because we'd been socialised to think that women should be secondary, that we should look after the men, we should take our husbands' names, we should, do all the housework, we should give up our jobs when we got married or got pregnant. And that was the way the world was. And so to have that pointed out as being unfair was an absolute revelation, and it was also the beginning of a revolution.
And did Germaine's book, Female Eunuch, did that have an impact?
Well, it did, but I was already well on my way by the time that book came out, so it reinforced everything that I thought. I mean, what was great about Germaine's book was that it was so radical in its language and in its and its concepts, and it was very daring the way it talked about sex in ways that weren't, hadn't been done before. And I mean, her book was fantastic. But I was already a feminist. We didn't call ourselves feminists back then. We thought feminism was a very bourgeois term. We called ourselves women's liberationists, shortened by the media to women's libbers. But her book influenced me, but a book that influenced me that came out about the same time much more was a book by Kate Millett, an American woman, called Sexual Politics. And that book was just another one of those books where my eyes were opened. She did the book had originally been a PhD thesis in literature, and she had done this absolutely scarifying, what we would now call a feminist analysis of the literature of Norman Mailer, William Burroughs, and I think Jean Genet. And I was huge fans of all of those writers, thought they were wonderful. And I hadn't realised the inbuilt misogyny that informed all of their writings. And again, it's one of those things, having had this pointed out to you, you could never unknow it. And that was the book that really kind of, I guess, changed my intellectual framework. Juliet Mitchell had changed my political framework. Germaine, in a way, I guess, changed the cultural framework. It was a very exciting time because we were just, we were learning new things all the time, and we were understanding that the world we inherited was not fair to us, and that we were going to change it.
Mm. And you did.
And I just want to pursue this just for one more question, and then we'll open it out into more nostalgia. But your own book, Dan Hawes and God's Police, I remember reading that and being struck by, apart from the intellect, obviously, the passion and the barely disguised anger that felt to me in that book. What made you think, God damn it, I want to write my book about this?
Well, at the time, I mean, we were reading Kate Millett and Robin Morgan, Sisterhood is Powerful. We were reading Juliet Mitchell, and we were reading Sheila Rowbotham. We were reading Germaine Greer was Australian, but she wrote that book in England. I mean, she was pretty much, it was an English book rather than an Australian book. These were all fantastic books, but they were all about other countries, and it just seemed to me that we needed our own story to be subjected to the same kind of feminist scrutiny. I mean, what was it about Australia that was so particularly, that was sexist, that held us back? And I remember when I had my first meeting with John Hooker, who was the publisher at Penguin, and I said to him, I'd really like to write a book about mateship and how that excludes women. And that was really where it started. And it was going to be a little book that I was going to write in 6 months. And fortunately, that didn't happen. It grew and grew and grew. And I remember when I first, read about the female convicts and how they had been forced to be sexual slaves to the male convicts and to the soldiers, the male settlers. And I had said to John Hooker, I think I rang him up and said, do you think you could publish a book with the title Damned Whores? And he just didn't hesitate. He said, yes, we could. Of course we could. And it was later I found out that the God's Police phrase from Caroline Chisholm. But what I wanted to do was to subject our own story, our own history and our own culture to the same kind of analysis that the American and the British women had been doing with their own cultures, so that we could relate to it. And in fact, that's what happened. People could relate to it. And, and I wrote about, the football or Australian literature and the way in which women had been so excluded. People recognised that because it was true.
And it's still a battle, as you would very well know.
Yes, it's not better, but it's certainly not over.
No, never. I don't think so. The formative cultural experiences you grew up with, were there many that you remember, like favourite songs, film, theatre?
Well, it's interesting thinking about this question because, when I grew up in Adelaide in the 50s, there wasn't much around, quite frankly. And we didn't have, television didn't come into Australia until 1956?
Yep.
And we didn't get a television in those early years. So I remember I used to go down the street to some lucky neighbour who had a television. I was allowed to go and watch, I think it was 77 Sunset Strip or some incredible American program. That was the big highlight. So we didn't, I can remember a few movies. I mean, we used to go to the pictures, as it was called, every Saturday afternoon, and there'd be the serial, the black and white serial, and then there'd be some film or other. I don't really remember any films from my youth because they weren't very memorable. I guess the three things I do remember is my parents they had one of these fabulous stereograms, as they were called, and they bought a lot of records, and they were very, very keen on American musicals. So we had all the musicals. We had The King and I, South Pacific, The Pajama Game, My Fair Lady, every musical of the time. And and we used to play them nonstop. I knew every single song off by heart, used to sing along. And I mean, it sounds pathetic now, but that was...
No, that's great.
I remember I used to sing along while I was doing... I'm not a very good singer, so I used to sing while I was doing the vacuuming, and that meant I could enjoy it, but no one could hear it.
Mm.
So we did that. The other thing is which made a huge impression on me when I was about, I think 8 or 9, my mother took me to an opera. And the opera was Madame Butterfly, and this left a huge impression on me because I'd never been to anything as grand as this is Adelaide at Theatre Royal in Adelaide. I don't even know who was doing it, so I'm sure it wasn't that wonderful. But to me, as a little girl, it was magical, and the story, of course, was so tragic.
Oh.
And the Cho-Cho Sam when she blindfolded the child and stabbed herself, I was just devastated.
Do you still love the opera?
I do, and you know,